Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Ferrari have revealed that the disqualifications they suffered in disastrous fashion at the Chinese Grand Prix will not necessarily be the last that either they or the rest of the grids suffer this season. Fred Vasseur believes as they continue to search a performance close to the limits indeed, Ferrari could be at risk of more disqualifications as the season goes on. This will not exactly be music to Lewis Hamilton's ears, given the fact that already in the championship, Ferrari and Hamilton and Leclerc find themselves in a rather compromised position. What do you guys think in the comments below? Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Beginning here again, Red Bull are teasing us, as they say, coming soon. It's going to be a white bull. What's exactly going to look like? My question really is, how different is it going to look to the RB, right? To the racing bull? Because that car is, it got praise for being effectively the white bull livery. They put it on the AlphaTauri. This year, they're going to do it for Japan on the Red Bull as well. So that's the big question. It's definitely happening though, because we've got further images here. This is a special cap they've unveiled for the weekend as well. I think even Verstappen had a couple of specific ones himself. There was this picture going around with the Verstappen logo on. There was this bucket hat design as well, seemingly special for this, final Honda Red Bull partnership at the Japanese Grand Prix. Here's Verstappen, of course, with his helmet for the weekend as well. So I think pretty clear that they're cooking something up. We'll probably see it over the next couple of days. It is interesting just to see. I mentioned this yesterday, but Kim Illman said in his post that the car was meant to be pink, maybe, like a cherry blossom looking thing, but that would have been too heavy. Pretty interesting to think why pink paint would be heavier than white paint. Maybe, the white paint requires less paint than the pink one, but also it could be the compounds that are used to create the pink paint might just be heavier than what they are for the white one. Whatever, that's what we think is going to be going on very shortly. Now, speaking of Perez, who was in the car, of course, famously, the most famous moment ever probably really for the white bull was that famous battle that Perez and Hamilton had at Turkey 2021, which was pretty influential in the title bid that year for Verstappen. Perez is out of the sport now, but he is, we believe, the favourite to get the drive at Cadillac next year, based on a few circumstances, one of which certainly is that there was big talk when Verstappen kind of took charge of the operations at Red Bull in terms of being the #1 driver, that the second seat was cursed to some degree. Now, Perez in his first year in the team kind of put paid to those suggestions. He wasn't great, but he was at least respectable, and in 2022 the same could be said as well. So the second seat curse came back in force in the last couple of years of Perez's time at Red Bull, but what's happened with Lawson so far is giving people the confidence that, maybe Sergio wasn't that bad after all. So Cadillac are reportedly looking at 4 different drivers. They're looking at Perez, they're looking at Bottas, who, look, I would probably put in the drive if I had to choose, but I understand from their perspective there are more factors in consideration, and I can certainly see why Perez could be more attractive for reasons outside of just pure sporting ones. Zhou, for maybe similar reasons, is also a big consideration given the Chinese influence, and then Colton Herta has got to be a decision as well. So there will be other names, I'd imagine, as well. I think Herta, American driver, probably will get a chance. But any of those 4 options, among others, may come into deep consideration over the coming months on that one. Now, I wanted to talk as well about Fernando Alonso, because he had a few interesting words to say on the V10s. It's honestly impressive how Ben Sulayem has managed, with this V10 comment, to distract somewhat from the shambles of his own organisation, and yet people are still talking about V10s a couple of weeks later. Now, is there any truth behind the idea? I believe that there is. Whether it's ever going to happen, that is a different question. But there is, if you guys are not familiar with this, the belief is that the 2026 engine rules are not going to be very good. I think we could have told you that when they were first drafted several years ago. The teams now developing them are starting to realise it in droves, and there's a big feeling that Mercedes next year may have the dominant unit again as they did in 2014, and the other teams are going to be in a tough spot. To such an extent that Ferrari and Red Bull reportedly are pushing for a move away from the new power drive hybrid, whatever people are going to call them, 50-50 engines, ICE to electrical that we're going to see next year. They were meant to last until at least 2030. The rumour has it they may try and get rid of them by even 2028 and actually stretch that time frame much shorter indeed. As a result, there was talk from Ben Sulayem, among others, what about returning to a V10 engine? Revered by many fans as being one of the greatest eras in the sport, the sounds, the noise, the energy, the drama, whatever. Makes a lot of sense if you can run them on biofuels, more sustainable fuels with, fewer emissions, stuff like this. And that is maybe where things are going. So this was thrown around as an idea. Some of the teams seem to be on board because, from competitiveness reasons. But also there's talk about, okay, well, what's really road relevant? That's what often there's talk about today. And maybe there is an argument to say that in the future, V8s, V10s with more sustainable fueling could be road relevant, even more so than the current hybrid units. But it's certainly relevant to see what the teams say, because when you hear anyone's perspective on this, you always got to look through it on the lens of what team do they drive for and what might that team potentially think, because Alonso is saying that we should not be bringing the V10s back, which is interesting given that he's, I think, the only driver on the grid who actually drove properly in that era. Obviously, I love the V10 era and the V10 and the sound of those cars that we all miss, but we're in a different world now. Technology has evolved and we now have incredibly efficient engines that use about 1/3 of the fuel that we're used to. We can't just go against our time in our hybrid era. It's like saying that we could run without the halo and make the cars more dangerous and create more adrenaline for the fans. So certainly an interesting perspective, not necessarily one that I was expecting. But what I will say is that this isn't complete. I saw a lot of comments on this discussion from Alonso saying, oh, well, the V10's just a pipe dream. It's never going to be happening anyway. I think it is possible that we go back to a more naturally aspirated engine with sustainable fuelings. I just don't think it's going to be a V10. I think there's going to be a compromise, and, there's talk on this even from Formula One themselves about, okay, well, Cadillac, they designed their car for the 2026 Ferrari rules. So let's say the 2026 engines just get scrapped and they go straight into V10s immediately, which was even a conversation that was thrown around, but that's never going to be happening, obviously. Cadillac simply wouldn't have a car because they've designed their car specifically for that new 26 Ferrari engine. But Simmons says that what's likely here, at least more likely, is some sort of compromise where we end up with, a V8, maybe even potentially a hybrid V8. So it's, maybe a little bit less outrageous than the V10, but it's maybe a little bit more exciting than what we have now. So I wouldn't be surprised if we move in this direction. Of course, I would be hoping for no hybrid at all and just pure internal combustion, but, that is probably many of your guys' preference as well, but we don't make the rules, and what the manufacturers want to try and achieve as well is relevant, because, how many production cars are still being made with V10s? Not that many. V8s, though, are still, pretty widely seen. Let's talk about Red Bull. Liam Lawson has been going through it. I respect how Ralf Schumacher, I don't know if there's any driver that he actually does like. I mean, there's only a couple, maybe, that he actually falls into favour of, but he did say this: I know that I'll be hated for this by one or two spectators, but I wouldn't have put Lawson in a Formula One car at all, he said to the press. And this was even from Jacques Villeneuve, who says he came into F1 last year saying how amazing he would be, and he had an attitude. When the results don't come, it makes everyone react even stronger. I guess that is a question for you guys. Would Lawson be getting more sympathy if he had a different mentality and approach when he came into the sport? Look, I don't mind a bit of arrogance in a driver thinking they're the man, but obviously if it backfires, you've got to be willing to take the heat, which is pretty much what has happened here. Even Max Verstappen, though, has been thrown into this convo too, because Bernie Collins has mentioned, given where Lawson was in the grid, is the Red Bull actually just the worst car and Max is just the best driver, like a complete alien? Maybe there's a little bit of truth to both, but I don't buy the idea that this Red Bull is actually that bad. It's clearly tricky to drive, but does anyone seriously believe that the Racing Bull is actually a faster car? Like, if you put everything together, there's just no way. In my opinion anyway, the Red Bull is definitely the faster car, and is probably a pretty damn fast car. If you can make it work, as Verstappen mostly can, and more so than anybody else, and Lawson was deeply struggling with, and confidence fell to pieces clearly, and that's why they kicked him out of the team immediately. Whether Yuki suffers the same fate, we'll see, but, I don't believe as yet that this Red Bull is really a complete tractor, and Verstappen is just extracting miracle performances from it. I think the Red Bull, it's got to be better than the Racing Bulls. Like, there's no doubt about that in my eyes. But I'm sure it is substantially harder to drive, and how is Yuki going to get on with that? That is the big question. Now, he was speaking to the press, of course, about this, and, he made a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment here saying that, yeah, pile the pressure on, pile on the expectations, and I'm going to deliver the goods as a result of it. So Tsunoda was talking to the press. I wanted to just share what he had to say about this because I thought it was all rather fascinating. And it started here where he said, to be honest, I never expected to be racing for Red Bull at the Japanese Grand Prix. This is the final year of the partnership. Still feels pretty unreal. Everything's fallen into place in just the right way. Obviously, I was happy about joining, but there's been a lot that he's had to go through over the last few days about seat fittings. He already had one, to be fair, last year for the test of the RB20. But yeah, my priority is to first understand the car, how it behaves compared to the V-Carb. If I can naturally enjoy driving it as I get familiar with it in FP1, the results will follow. Don't want to raise expectations too much, but for this Japanese Grand Prix, I want to finish on the podium. So, I mean, it would be a mega story. And, look, it's pretty unlikely that Yuki will make the podium. I think, let's just do Q2 first. Let's get into Q2. Then we can think about Q3. And then, Tsunoda and Red Bull can start to think about delivering better results than that. Of course, he's never driven the car, which is a bit of a problem. But he did say this when I got the call. I said, wow, this is going to be interesting. There aren't many moments in life where you face this kind of extreme pressure and an opportunity as big as this. I can only imagine that it's going to be an incredibly thrilling race. And I was too busy to take the time to fully appreciate the excitement. Straight into the sim, do the seat fittings, take care of other preparations. He already did a seat fitting as well because he's the reserve driver this year. But he did say a couple of interesting things, that in the simulator, he didn't find the car that challenging to drive. So, and also he admitted, they didn't do the full quote in the article here, but he also said that, you guys remember last year, we even discussed it yesterday, when Tsunoda was in the RB20, he drove it around Abu Dhabi, and afterwards he said, yeah, the car fits me great, I'm loving life, this is my car, I'll deliver a great result, kick Perez out, put me in. They didn't do that, but they did kick Perez out. And he admitted today that that was a bit of a sales pitch. He was just kind of saying a couple of things to try and convince Christian Horner. So maybe a little bit too much honesty there from Yuki. But his numbers in the simulator seemingly speak for themselves because, as Yuki says, I didn't find the car to be that challenging to drive. Obviously, it's the simulator, so it's a different story. I definitely got the impression that the front end is very responsive, as people often say, because that's what Max tends to like. But if you ask whether it felt tricky to handle, I wouldn't say that it gave me a particularly strange feeling, at least in the simulator. Of course, how I want to set up the car is probably different from Max. I want to develop my own car setup, get a good understanding of it, and gradually get up to speed from FP1. So this is pretty interesting, to be fair, right? Because we've seen this discussed previously, that even Helmut Marko has said, look, just take Verstappen's setup, do what you can with it, don't try and mess around too much, because this was apparently what Perez was trying to do, and they stopped him from doing it. Perez was trying to do his own setups to suit his own preference, and it wasn't working. And they were like, look, you're just going to take Max's setups and struggle and just deal with the pain. Now, Yuki straight up says, yeah, I'm not going to just do that. I think I'm correct in saying that's what they told Lawson, isn't it? There was an article that we discussed a while ago now where Red Bull effectively told Lawson, don't mess with the setups, just drive the car. And Yuki, day one, is saying, yeah, I want to set the car up differently. I'm not just going to sit back here and relax. I want my car to drive a certain way. I'm going to work with my garage to make that happen. And honestly, Red Bull at this point have to kind of yield to that, I would say, because otherwise they would be at risk of saying, well, once again, they're downplaying the feedback and the opinion of a second driver whose opinion is actually very important if they want to try and create a car that's actually drivable by someone that isn't called Max Verstappen. So it is a fascinating story. It's the story of the upcoming weekends, and Yuki is being pretty gung-ho, and he's like, yeah, I want to be on the podium. That would be incredible. Obviously, unlikely as it stands, because even Max getting on the podium is far from a guarantee. But yeah, I respect that Yuki has the optimism that he can handle this tricky machine, and I think that he's going to do a better job than Lawson. Is it going to be spectacular? How's it going to be compared to Lawson in the Racing Bull? That is an important question. And obviously, Red Bull no longer have the services of Adrian Newey to help solve some of their issues. As Marko was asked the question, are you missing Newey? What's going on there? And he says, yeah, of course we're missing a guy like that. A Newey is a Newey. So, yeah, he's now at Aston Martin, and maybe that's one of the reasons why Alonso said what he said about the V10s, because there's the belief that in 2026 they're going to have a great car, and they don't want to mess it up. Going forwards beyond that, that's one way to look at it anyway. But I wanted to discuss Ferrari before we close the show, because, man, it's a tricky time at the Scuderia right now. We discussed it yesterday. Their car isn't really what they would want it to be. They're struggling with the difference between getting the rear to be nice and stable and the actual ride heights they can run. And of course, famously, well, I mean, infamously in many respects, in China, the double disqualification, especially Hamilton's disqualification, which is the same as what happened to Leclerc and Hamilton when he was at Mercedes at Austin 2023. So as I say, Ferrari have now been disqualified twice for that same discrepancy over the last couple of seasons, Austin 23 and then China 2025. And it's obviously a complete embarrassment for Ferrari. But Vasseur has a pretty interesting perspective and says, yeah, we must have been too aggressive, that's how it is. This setback shows that we are in search of perfection and that sometimes we look too far. So I'll share what Vasseur has to say and then I'll criticize it, because I think that, again, it doesn't quite tell the full picture here, right? So Vasseur says, for sure, there will be a lot of other disqualifications. Now, I don't think he necessarily just means from his team, but what he's effectively saying is, you've got to push the limits to try and win in F1, and by pushing the limits, occasionally you're going to go over the limits, which is probably fair. But is it fair enough? So Vasseur says, one must distinguish between disqualification because you take risk and disqualification because somebody is cheating. The goal of the game in F1 is to push yourself to the limit of all parameters everywhere, to get the last gram of weight, to get to the last tenth of a millimeter on the plank on the floor wear indicator. They were 4 to 5 tenths of a millimeter, which is, nothing really, but beyond the limit nonetheless, to get to the last millimeter of wing deformation. So certainly, the more pressure we are under, the more intense the battle, the more we need to get close to these limits and the more risks that we take. So I think on some level this is probably fair enough, but the problem comes that the team, it was their second race of the year. If you're going to push the limits to this extent, it shows, I think, in many respects that they simply do not have the car to justify anything else. Ferrari seem to feel like they are so on the limit of their performance, like they're trying to get every single last millimeter out to gain an advantage, because they're not going to be good enough without taking the risk. Let's say you were going down to Abu Dhabi 2025. It's in the fight for the Constructors' Championship. Your car is probably good enough to win, or you can take the small risk that you're, maybe even a substantial risk. You're going to get disqualified to have the fastest car, run it closer to the ground, generate more performance. What are you going to do? In that scenario, you might take the risk or not take it, depending on what the situation looks like in the championship. If you're a few rounds to go and you're substantially behind in the championship, yeah, sure, then you may take the risk. Taking this level of risk, if that's how you might describe it from Vasseur, in the second race of the year, especially after you just won the sprint race. So clearly there was some performance there in the machine, is a concern, because I think it shows to me that Ferrari are not confident in their car, because they're forcing themselves to take these absolute last tenth of a millimeter risks to try and gain any performance they can, and it's still not good enough. They still finished 5th and 6th in the Grand Prix, way behind the McLarens, who of course have not been disqualified at all over the last few years for similar things. So either it's a car issue, which is causing the plank wear that they don't necessarily want because they are forced to run at ride heights that are not exactly optimal, or they are taking too much risk, let's be honest. I mean, when both of your cars get disqualified from the same Grand Prix, that is not excusable because you are taking more risk. Like, your competitors also have to take risk. You took too much risk. Like, that is the only way to analyze it. Either you made a big mistake or you took way more risk than you should have done, because in no world should both of your cars be getting disqualified. Sure, maybe you take a 5% risk factor of a disqualification in your calculations to gain extra performance. That is risky, and maybe you want to take the risk. But for it to happen to both cars, that's a mistake somewhere, right? So, Vasseur says a couple of things, and I read them and I think, I'm not so sure that Ferrari are getting on top of these problems anytime soon. And, Hamilton, the only point he really has in the championship from him is winning the sprint, and it's pretty much the same story for Charles Leclerc as well after a tricky start. I mean, Williams last year scored 17 points all year. Williams this year have scored 17 points so far this season, and Ferrari this year have scored 17 points so far this season. So comment on Twitter your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.